Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you Mr. Russ Moulton.
Thank you, Ashley. That was really nice. I'm going to have to ask you to go along and introduce me every time I present. It's very nice of you. I'm here to talk to you today about maybe a misconception that game engines, although cool, lack what it takes to do sensors right. What I want to talk to you about today is some recent advancements in the commercial modeling and sim marketplace that are challenging that and showing that we can do sensors to the credibility we need for training for the warfighter. Next slide, please. So why sensors? Why do we use them? As Ashley touched on, we use it for seeing at night, for seeing through bad weather, detecting and recognizing threats of various kinds, identifying friend or foe, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and search and rescue, navigation, other type missions. Next slide. And in particular, as Ashley talked about, the U.S. and our allies across the world have a tremendous advantage in sensors. We want to dominate the battlefield in terms of sensors. Some of the things that give us that advantage are third-generation image intensifiers, second-gen thermal imagers, and those things are being driven by high-resolution focal plane arrays, and advanced radar technology that's coming on the scene that we have that no one else has. We put our sensors together in multispectral sensor suites that give us the ability to switch between sensor bands and exploit the band that's most advantageous to us. We have satellite aircraft and a proliferation of sensors now in UAVs, so we're putting them everywhere, ground surveillance networks, etc. And we have new sensors always coming online, like hyperspectral and LiDAR and others. So as Ashley talked about, we get the advantage of night attack and the element of surprise, which is absolutely crucial to carrying the day in a conflict. We get superior detection in standoff ranges. We want to be able to see them before they see us. And in many conflicts, as you've seen from some of the video on CNN, we've been able, U.S. and our allies, to attack and eliminate the enemy before they even knew what hit them. So this really underscores the need for sensor training and exploitation. You can have the best sensors out there, but if the warfighter's not equipped to exploit it, it really is of no value. Next slide. So sensors in serious games. Clearly, with game engines, we want the experience to be enjoyable, fun, and the training experience to be somewhat transparent to the user, to not even know that he's getting that kind of training. But we want to avoid having not just the cool effects, we want those cool effects to be physically credible, to be realistic, and hopefully accurate. We want to support ease of use and support, like in database creation and model creation, so it's not painful to create these things. And of course, we want to keep our sensor simulation software lightweight and high performance, because game engines, of course, we want to keep them low cost, and when we want to keep them running on commercially available GPU graphics cards. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what's required for sensors? You really want a faithful representation of the sensor. And what does faithful representation mean? Well, in the crudest sense, for military simulation, you want to be able to preserve what they call search and target acquisition. That is, you want the correct ranges and probabilities for detection, classification, recognition, and identification. You want to be able to see that threat at the range you would see him, through those smokes or through that atmospheric fog that you would experience when you're doing real mission planning and rehearsal. Okay? If it's just cool but has the wrong effect, you're not detecting at the right ranges, or you're detecting at ranges that are superficial. That can lead to negative training, a sense of confidence, and people can die. Missions fail. Next slide. So to support credible target acquisition for sensors, there's a number of key elements we need. We need signatures, we need atmospherics, we need sensor effects modeling, we need complex scenes that are typical of real battlefield scenes, and we need adequate sampling of both the target and the background to avoid aliasing effects, particularly with intense sources like infrared. And to support the game industry, we need on-demand, on-the-fly responses where the user is not having to sit and pre-compute scores of lookup tables or spend days preparing in order to be able to play the game on the database he wants to play it, and with the models he wants to play it with. Next slide, please. And hit the down key 2 more times. 1 more time. Now this is a very busy slide, and there's going to be a quiz afterwards, so study hard. No, not really. This is intentionally busy to show you the amount of phenomenology that you really need to pack into your sensor simulation to do it right. Next slide, please. So under signatures, to do them right for serious games, we need to be able to do 3D models and terrains. We need to be able to classify them, that is, put in physical materials to them, stipulate depths and dimensions and those sorts of things, and establish thermal boundary conditions in the case of thermal infrared to run thermal models. And of course, we want to be able to run our thermal models on the fly so that the game user is not having to pre-compute and run thermal models every time he wants to run a different target on a different weather condition or a different time of day. We want the game engine to be able to do these signatures predictably, physics-based, and on the fly. For thermal, that means correct surface temperatures, responding to environmental effects, rain, sleet, snow, weather, time of day, air temperature. We want to be able to see diurnal cycle effects, things that the real sensor operator would look for, things like thermal crossover, thermal inversion of vegetation with the natural background. We want directional time history-based solar loading. In thermal, as you know, based on the angle of a surface, something could be have a higher surface temperature due to the sun than other things. In the case of radar, we want to be able to have on-the-fly radar signature prediction tools that are credible to give us the right detection range for the radar. And we want the surface optical effects to be realistic, because in many sensors like midwave IR, directional solar and glint effects from midwave IR can really be distracting, but they're what you see in real midwave IR imagery. Next slide, please. So some of the technologies that are available today are things like 3D thermal modeling and material classification that can be done very quickly with various tool sets. This particular tool set is our Genesis MC tool set that allows you to do the modeling not through the wireframe, but through the texture itself. Things that gamers are typically used to working with. Here you see an instance where we've material classified and put in thermal sources into a truck texture that enables it to run in the game engine on the fly, dynamically using the cooling. Next slide, please. This shows you another demo we've run in the game engine. Basically, this is a T-72 heating up over time under various states of engine state and frictional heating. Next slide, please. And then cooling off over time, all dynamically, on the fly, on demand, real time. For terrains, tools like Genesis MC have a semi-automated approach with advanced image processing algorithms that allow you to train your material classification on your database set. You've got thousands of image tiles that comprise a tactical scene. You bring in one image, you train it on it, the algorithm's tuned to it, establish signature metrics, and go to town processing in batch all of the visual textures in your visual database to give you corresponding mid-mappable sensor texture. Next slide, please. There's a lot of advanced algorithms today that go into the image processing that result in material classification, and here we just briefly list a few of them. Next slide, please. And you can see some of the result of a typical material classification that's done very quickly with the tool, and the kinds of credible responses you get in the textures to check your result at various sensor bands at various times of day. That's one of the most common things that are done in material classification, is to run your textures through a signature predictor to see if you're getting a reasonable sensor response. Next slide. One of the problems we run into with all simulation, not just serious games, is in the case of material classification, you can get very cartoony looking regions where your material classifier might have said, hey, this is a forested region and I'm going to assign it a deciduous tree, maybe a valley oak tree. But you don't want everything in that entire area to be a tree leaf. Okay? So there are techniques where one can go back to the visual channel to try to estimate what the surface normal shadowing, interior shadowing is of various features, and then use that construct on the fly in the GPU to add reasonable detail. This is particularly important for mid-wave IR sensors, which are all over the place today, because mid-wave IR focal plane arrays are cheap to produce. You can produce them at very high resolution, sometimes super resolution, so they're basically all over the place. This shows you for a long-wave IR material classification sim the difference between the traditional approach and the on-the-fly enhanced detail approach for the sensor imagery. Next slide, please. But beyond that, there's some new capability that's making it really even easier for gamers to deal with the chore of material classification to do physics-based sensor imagery. And that's something we call on-the-fly. With databases today having more and more vector and shapefile data available, we can now leverage this on the fly in the GPU and accomplish reasonable material classification on the fly. All done at the same cycle that you're doing the rendering and the signature prediction, atmospherics, and sensor effects, all in real time. We demonstrated this at ITSIC last year. It does a fully automated material classification of the terrain in the GPU using the shape and vector file data. We use algorithms in color space domain and some other sophisticated K-means algorithms in the GPU that allow us to do reasonable material classification assignments, and then convert them on the fly to a mappable format for materials, generating final per pixel classification and signature prediction. Next slide, please. But beyond that, to do on-the-fly signatures, you have to have the ability to predict the ephemeris and the resulting spectral meteorology that arises from that ephemeris. I'm talking about spectral solar, downwelling sky infrared, upwelling ground IR, of course, radiance from the moon in its various phases, and of course, from the star constellation. Next slide, please. And you need on-the-fly, on-demand transient thermal model. It's highly optimized, running on the CPU with a low overhead, so it doesn't impact your frame rate or the other CPU functions that the game engine has to be doing. Here we're showing you some output from our real-time on-the-fly signature solver called SIGSIM, and you can see the results that you get for various man-made materials, what we call material systems, in the 3D virtual database. You can see things like angle-dependent solar loading. You can see radiatively cooling at night in the low ditch there, and you can see the thermal crossover, where the vegetative items are crossing over with the man-made items there. There's also techniques we can do on the fly for angle-dependent solar loading, and that's not just a simple cosine element. That's parameterizations that you can do to keep the time history going in a pipeline processor, so that based on whether a building surface is north, east, west, or south facing, you can get the appropriate transient thermal loading in the pipeline on the GPU. Next slide, please. Why is that important? Well, you can look here at a very complex scene. This is Oahu, with lots of buildings and lots of clutter. You can see the effect of solar loading here on the buildings as a function of their angle at each various time of day. Notice the T72 in the right bottom foreground. And notice how it stands out differently based on the time of day and the diurnal cycle effects of all the clutter around it. Clearly, in some of these times of day, the T72 target sticks out more prominently. Next slide, please. Of course, surface reflection is important, particularly in military simulation. We're talking military paints. We're talking special surfaces like water. Next slide, please. You want on-the-fly modeling that can deal with more advanced VRDF reflection models, like the Sanford-Robertson model, which the U.S. government finds the best for credible simulation for sensors, which we've implemented here as well. Next slide. And you can see some of the differences you get between a typical FONG-type model, energy-conserving FONG, and a Sanford-Robertson specular component there. Look at the water tower and the difference in the mid-wave IR. Next slide, please. Of course, for simulation like image intensifiers, second and third gen NVGs, Light sources are critically important. You have to model them physically. The filaments, the gaseous makeup of each of the lights, and their spectral responses. Next slide, please. Because the idea here is, particularly for airports and other urban scenes, you're going to have tens of thousands of light sources in your scene. You need to be able to keep up with them real time, not only in terms of the prediction of the various types of lights you have in the scene and the characteristic look and feel they have in image intensifiers, but also image processing effects, like the light point haloing that you get. Here we show an on-the-fly approach where we use the GPU in a real-time image processing sense, where the pointance is computed for each light and goes into a full 32-bit 2D radiance array that is hitting the simulated aperture, and the image processor in the GPU is processing the blur, the noise, the MTF, the light point haloing, and the like, so that there's no additional expense regardless of the number of light points. Next slide, please. Of course, we want to be able to cover the entire domain. Many of the platforms out there today, like UAVs or aircraft, have multispectral sensor suites, EO, IR, radar, and they can switch between the two of them or simultaneously view them. We can't allow in a game application for there to be a long delay or there to be artifacts like terrain tiles paging in based on the sensor mode that you switch. We've shown here that with today's technology we can do this and keep up with it credibly. Here you see a visible near IR, radar search scan mode, SAR mode, and various midwave and long wave images at various times a day. All instantly switchable in a game engine. Next slide. And again, another representation of instantly switchable from direct view optics and out the window all the way out to SAR and sweep scan type radars. Next slide, please. Here we show a maritime scene. Next slide, please. In near infrared. Next slide. And midwave IR. Next slide. For image intensifiers like NVGs, real-time shadowing is key. That's the biggest source of clutter, perhaps other than the light points, in an NVG type tactical scenario. Here you see real-time shadows being cast and radiometrically correct, rendered in our sensor plug-in and Habit. Next slide, please. You see the light points dynamically moving with the vehicles, where the light points are reflectively loading the terrain surface. Next slide, please. Midwave IR. Next slide. And long wave IR. Next slide, please. Here we show our on-the-fly, real-time GPU-based SAR. Most radar image processing today for IGs for training is done in a completely separate IG, a CPU-based radar simulator. We're showing that it's possible to do real-time, highly credible physics-based radar on the GPU in a game engine. Next slide. What else do you need besides credible signature effects? Well, you need credible atmospherics. It's particularly important for target acquisition. The effects of spectral transmittance, path radiance, and scattering can play havoc, of course, over lines of sight, even with the most high-contrast target. Next slide, please. We've shown that you can do an on-the-fly, real-time path interval based on Modtran 4.0 that's very credible. It can update the GPU lookup tables at the frame rate of the game engine. Here we're showing various real-time on-the-fly computations for various sensor bands. And on the right-hand side of the display, you can see two technical scenarios, one clear day, one cloudy day. And it really shows the advantage of all weather for radar. Here you see a typical line-of-sight scenario where the X-band SAR can get through the cloud with only about a 20% attenuation. Of course, all the optical bands and thick clouds are decimated. Next slide, please. This shows you how important the atmospherics are for the search and target acquisition for sensors. This is a simulation that was done for Predator UAV operators in Iraq that shows you basically for their training, basically 4 tactical scenarios. And you can see the effect of ground targets for dismounted infantry as well as ground vehicles. You can see the washout that you get over longer lines of sight and how the contrast drops off, the scene kind of brightens up from the atmospheric haze. This is a real tactical problem the warfighter needs to deal with. Next slide. And again, the atmospheric effects that you can do on the fly with this real-time path interval driven by Modtran and I mean not mod train lookup tables, but underlying mod train algorithms running on the fly, is this kind of atmospheric that you can simulate in real time. Next slide, please. The sensor effect simulation is the post-aperture image processing, if you will, that mucks up the image, but it mucks it up in an incredible electro-optic engineering way. You have to be able to model the optics, because every sensor is not the same. Some sensors are very high resolution, have very expensive, very heavy optics. Some, like you might put on a micro UAV, have very puny optics with a lot of diffraction blur. So you want to be able to model these types of things. You want to be able to do it quickly and without the game player having to be a sensor expert to do it. We've shown that you can do that. You can put together the credible engineering. You can basically dumb it down with sliders that allow you to drive the engineering level parameters, or you can allow them to put the OEM sensor specs directly into the GUI. You also want to model the detector. This is particularly important for focal plane arrays where 1 over F noise and fixed pattern noise is increasingly the issue. And then post-filtering effects. What kind of electronics boost and post-processing do you have after the detector array and onto the display? Next slide, please. These slides show you some of the GUIs that show you the kinds of parameters you can allow the user to adjust on the fly. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So why is this important? If you look in the lower right, you can see the effect of long wave versus mid wave and the difference in the aperture size of your optics, right? The bigger the optic, obviously, the greater resolution and clarity of your imagery. But there goes your cost, and there goes your weight on your platform, right? You've got to put them on bigger and bigger platforms, and you've got to spend more money to develop the sensor. Increasingly, we go with cheaper, greater volume of sensors out there with optics that aren't as good. You tend to get images that are down to the left-hand side of this lower right box and show the difference in blur. And you can see the difference in the spectral band of your image too. Mid-wave will give you better diffraction limited performance than what long wave will. Next slide, please. Another thing that's critically important, particularly if you're doing training, is human perception and the flicker effect you get in infrared. We have discovered that if you simply do cut and paste from targets and you don't super sample them, you get this aliasing flicker effect, particularly for intense sources, which becomes an automatic cue. And the warfighter thinks he can detect at incredible ranges when in fact he can't. This kind of illustrates mathematically what's going on here. Next slide, please. Here we show on the left-hand side a typical view of maybe two F-18s side by side just over to the right. On the left in the center is a F-18 that has been super sampled. And on the right is an F-18 that's traditionally sampled in our game engines. And you can see on the right-hand column, you can see that the consistency of the F-18 and the subpixel sampling that you get versus the fade in and flicker you get for the F-18 that isn't appropriately sampled. We've demonstrated that in game engines we can in fact super sample targets and maintain that kind of fidelity and avoid that artifact. Next slide, please. Special effects are important. This is an area where in game engines in particular, we love the cool effects, but can you really see that through that smoke cloud? Can you really see through that explosion? These are the kinds of things that you want to make sure that you get right, that you've got the physics in there determining what the transmittance, path radiance, and scattering is through these special effects. We've shown that we can take game engine particle systems and basically sensorize them. Look at those intrinsic visual domain rendering constructs for particle systems and use our on-the-fly libraries, physics-based, to determine sensor band transmittances, path radiances, and scattering coefficients that use the same construct as the very nice game engine effect for particle solids. Next slide, please. Most of the demo images I've shown you have come from the sensor plugin that we've done with Havoc, the game engine Havoc, and they show you the capability that's now available here, and to prove out that you can do these high fidelity sensor effects for training on the fly, on demand, and real time, incredibly in a low cost game engine. These are the various features of the plugin. Actually, how am I doing on time? Am I good?
Yep.
Okay. I may have even been going too fast. We're supporting DirectX X9, 11, and OpenGL platforms. We support arbitrary switchable near IR, mid-wave, long-wave, and whatever arbitrary sensor parameters that the user wants to put in this configuration for the type of thermal imager or image intensifier they have. There's engineering level sensor effects. You can either put that in the XML config file or bring it up in the GUI to control it. We're taking more and more of the content out of Havoc and pre-running it through both for the models and the terrain through the Genesis MC classifier so that they're available and ready to go. And again, the nice thing about this is it means that you don't have to redo it based on the time of day, the time of year, the environmental or weather effects. It's all dynamic, environmentally responsive to whatever those conditions are, and you don't have to go back and pre-compute. Next slide, please. In the movie I'm going to be showing you here in a moment, you'll see that we've taken a large area of the Oahu database, courtesy of the Hawaii state government, and run it through our semi-automated material classifier. We've been able to show that we can do this both as a pre-computed, very fast pre-computed material classification of all of Oahu, Hawaii, as well as using their vector and shapefile data, do it all the same, completely on the fly, rendering from source. As I've spoken about before, of course, in Hawaii you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lights. We've shown with this technique that we can keep up with that physically, credibly, rendering the lights, doing the light point haloing, having the dynamic effects of when vehicles or sensor line of sight perspective blocks your view of the light point, like say through tree leaves, the halo pops in and out just as it would in a real sensor system. Next slide, please. Obviously, for NVG, getting the signatures right means we've got to do our lunar irradiance modeling spectrally, not only for the pass band, but for any other sensor band that needs it. Artificial source modeling and ground reflection, we've got covered in here in the plugin. The sensor effects are credible based on an engineering level model of the image intensifier and the microchannel plate technology that goes along with second and third gen image intensifiers. Shadowing is done dynamically, real time on the fly, using the Havoc IG constructs, and then rendering in physics-based correct for the radiances at aperture from the shadows. Next slide, please. And you'll see some of the dynamic shadows running in the movie real time. Next slide, please. Vehicles aren't static. Obviously, they have dynamic states. Engines turn on and off. Tires move and create frictional heating. Tank treads move and create bogie wheel and track heating. All of these things we were able to control and drive on the fly, on demand, in real time within Havoc using the sensor plugin. All the surface temperature prediction is being done on the fly, predicted. You can turn rain on and off. You can increase the wind speed. All the convective cooling effects take place just as it would in a real mission planning scenario. We talked about the angle-dependent solar loading. We talked about the benefits of doing the physics on the fly. You get thermal crossover effects, diurnal cycle effects that fall out naturally. Next slide, please. Now, if you run the movie here, you can see here basically what we are able to bring in is the on-the-fly content from the Oahu database, rendering it from source, and you can see that we can add light points to it, cast those lights on the terrain. Here we have a very intense atmospheric day. You see the vehicles moving, the light points from the vehicles, not only light point haloing, but casting light on the terrain surface. This is switched right over to mid-wave IR. Various dismounted soldiers, ground vehicles, civilian and military. This is long-wave infrared. Notice the better contrast you get with the long-wave infrared on natural terrain features, but you get less intensity out of the intense man-made thermal sources. Here we're showing you dynamically changing the time of day, so you can see the diurnal cycle effects. Notice the thermal crossover there with the road and the terrain basically washed out into one. You can see the relative contrast differences of the target with the background. It's a function of time of day. All of this is happening with the physics updating on the fly. Here we're going to show you what we showed at ITSIC this year, which is the ability to do dynamic shadows. with the intense scene clutter that you get in NVG scenarios, the dynamic shadows really can be a bit overwhelming for the warfighter, but it's a realistic effect. It's something he has to contend with. This is particularly helpful, not only for getting the angle of the shadows right based on the moon phase and direction, but when you put in special effects like flares and the like. Here we're showing you the dynamic heating of the T-72 target. And the actual sim and not the encoded movie version, it's a lot smoother than that. You're seeing it jump quite a bit. He's advanced the time on us, and in the movie encoding, it makes it a little bit more staccato. We're showing you the effect when we switch over to the maritime-based scenarios. Notice the lunar reflections for the mid-wave IR. Essentially, the lunar is essentially reflected solar off of the ocean surface. And notice the reflection of the thermal signature from the ship on the water. This simply shows you the real-time nature of the ability to do the sensor effects on the fly. Obviously, being able to set the right MTF for your optics, for your overall system MTF for your entire system, noise effects and the like. This is a somewhat trivial demo, but with the GUI, you can change the density of the focal plane array, the detector pitch, the pixel fill, all of those things, the 1/f noise, all of those things that come from the various technology of the sensor that you have. Give the warfighter an accurate target acquisition picture and visual representation from that specific sensor. Obviously, cheap sensors give you poorer resolution. The more expensive the sensor, the crisper the resolution you're going to get, the greater the detection ranges, and particularly the greater classification recognition in ID ranges. So how did I do on time? 10 minutes. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Please.
On the shadowing, the dynamic shadowing, does it move also with the wind manipulating the trees, or is it based on diurnal?
It would move with the wind moving the trees. The shadows are being cast and to pass on the fly. The light source itself is the spectral prediction on the fly of the directional and the diffuse lunar and man-made light source irradiances. So that entire light field is taken into account, and wherever that physical object is, tree, leaf, or branch at that time, the shadow will update. You notice when the soldiers were moving, those shadows were going along with them. They weren't just a shadow texture being draped underneath the soldier.
For your models, for example, for your vehicles, what's giving you your initial thermal signature that you're basing all the physics off from?
Right. So it all goes off of the texture and the insight that the modeler has as to where the heat source is. If it's an engine block, he basically looks at the texture and says, where's the projected contour of the engine block on the engine hood? He draws that in, and then he draws in an outer region that he wants the thermal model to compute the signature out to. So those internal sources are placed through the texture as a projected area and area boundary. And then in the GUI, you have to assign, is it an engine block at 200 degrees C? What is the thickness of the hood, the underlying insulation? What is the air gap? What is the exhaust port temperature of the engine? You put those things in. The thermal model within the product forms a three-dimensional nodal mesh, solves it, gets a time-based two-dimensional surface gradient, which it encodes in a unique way into the texture, which is then driven by the game engine on the fly to give you the right surface spatial temperature variation as a function of time and space. This is a pretty innovative technique. We had a couple PhDs work on this and showed that this technique could approximate the full 3D transient solution of the heat diffusion equation with a bounded error in space and time. So it gives you a very reasonable appearance.
So for example, for like vehicles from foreign countries, you don't have access.
That's exactly right.
So you're having to do some open source analysis of what.
Right. You know, it's based on your knowledge. You know, this product is 100% EAR 99. We have a commodity jurisdiction through State Department. It's no longer ITAR. But to keep it that way, we obviously cannot provide that detailed data. Right? That comes from the customer.
And then my last question is there a specific ephemeris that you choose to use, or is that dictated by the customer? Or is it-
The way this product is set up is you got two options. Usually IGs have their own position, the sun and moon, and if you set the switch setting, it'll take and drive it off of that. Usually those IGs don't have a very good spectral band prediction of what, say, the mid-wave infrared 3 to 5 is for the at surface spectral irradiance of the sun from 0.3 to 25 micron. So we fill in at that point with the physics-based prediction. But the actual ephemeris locations of the moon and the sun and the stars and all that, we can take from the IG, or we can supply it if the IG doesn't have it, or you want to use the sensor plug-in ephemeris. Good questions. Other questions? Yes, Ashley.
What would you say is still missing or needs further development with this and/or other gaming technology in terms of
Sure.
simulation reading?
Good question. In fact, there was somebody in here that I met with earlier this week that asked some of those questions. Some things we're working on adding to the simulation are the kinds of things we've been able to do in ray tracing using the Optic Scenics ray tracer with NVIDIA. But since most game engines, obviously, I don't know of any of them that are using ray tracing, some of those effects we can't do. What we're talking about is credible physics-based coupling of things like vehicle undercarriages, tank tracks, etc., fires, loading other things. We are going to be adding to the product some capability in this area that's physics-based, and we're going to validate it against the ray tracer, which is the gold standard for whether I'm doing radiosity correct. So it's that kind of few-factor thermal exchange from one object to the other that's not in there now, but we're going to be adding it soon. Any other questions? Super. Well, thank you very much. There's some material here on what I've talked about here and on the Havoc plugin if you'd like up front.